Welcome back, everyone, to Rabbit Hole Stories. And with today's guest, I'm really excited. We have Frank Corva on from the Bitcoin Magazine team, Forbes editor. Frank, what would be the best title to introduce you?
Oh, I think right now, at least through the election season, I was both the business and political correspondent for Bitcoin Magazine. For Forbes, I'm a contributor, and I contribute stories of Bitcoin adoption around the world. I think particularly focused in developing economies, focusing on circular economies, activists using Bitcoin, things like that.
Nice.
So only a small role within the Bitcoin ecosystem then. No doubt, Frank, I mean, thank you, first of all, for finding the time to chat to us here over at Rabbit Hole Stories, because no doubt your head is still spinning from the recent events that have unfolded over the last few days when it comes to the US elections and the whole space at the moment. There's a lot of narratives flying about, which we can get into. And here at Rabbit Hole Stories, it is what it says on the tin. And we kick it off with, how did you discover Bitcoin, Frank? And how did you end up in this place where your head is spinning at a fantastical rate, trying to catch up with the ever-evolving space that is Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question. A lot of people in my life, given my background, which I'll get into a bit, are quite surprised that I sort of went as far down the Bitcoin rabbit hole as I have. But then they've also come back around and said, actually, you know what? Now this totally makes sense, especially given what I was just saying about the topics that I cover for Forbes. And even some of the stuff I've written as a writer who writes about politics now. But to get to your point, to technically say when it started, it was the first or second week of January 2018. I had heard of the term cryptocurrency before that, but I was actually on the way home from helping a friend of mine paint his house in New Jersey. I live in New York City, which is about an hour away. And, was sort of like, a friend of mine was having a birthday party at a bar in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And he was like, please come out. And I was like half tired, like, just painting this house. Don't really want to go out. But I was like, okay, let me do it. Went to the bar. It was maybe my first or second time at a bar since I had decided to take a year off from drinking. So I was on New Year's Eve 2017. I decided to take a year off from drinking just to save money. Living in New York City, even if you go out drinking on like a Friday and Saturday night, it's very easy to spend. Even if you're spending $60-$70, I mean, drinks now. I mean, this isn't even drinks. That's like nothing at this point. Drinks now are like $15 to $20 minimum. So it's like you could spend that kind of money with being nowhere near an alcoholic. Just having 2 or 3 drinks on a Friday and Saturday night. So I said, okay, looking to save some money, let me stop drinking. And I still attribute that notion that I stopped drinking to the idea that I got Bitcoin that night. So I went to this party. A friend of mine was invested in XRP. He did not teach me what Bitcoin was that night, or he sort of did, but he kind of gave me the broader idea of cryptocurrency as he understood it at that time. I would say he wasn't necessarily far down the rabbit hole. He was just sort of following that narrative from 2017, the hype cycle around XRP and all that stuff. It didn't take me long after for me to then sort of, figure out what Bitcoin was, how it differed, all that kind of stuff. But that night he sat and described it to me, and I was utterly fascinated with just the concept of something that wasn't controlled by the state or a corporation. I was like this thing that I just couldn't sort of grasp. I didn't know enough about, like, I don't even know, like, the role that gold has played in financial systems over the last 5,000 years, or the fact that it's used as a way to store value. I mean, like, I kind of knew that, but I didn't really know it. I didn't care about this stuff as much. My background before all this was I was a teacher, college lecturer, working in developing countries, doing, I guess, human rights oriented work, education. I was not in finance, any of this stuff. So understanding some of the reason for Bitcoin, that was far above my pay grade, but in January 2018. But it was the way that my friend talked about it. I mean, granted, he probably turned $1,000 into like $20,000 or something, so I'm sure he was really excited to talk about it. But there was something about it. What clicked immediately for me was I had come up in sort of the punk and hardcore scene on Long Island and New York City. So a lot of people know maybe CBGB's, where the Ramones started, and the Bad Brains and all these early punk bands. I've performed at CBGB's with my own sort of, heavier band and stuff like that. And I was in the music industry from 1999 till about 2006 or 7 or so. And I worked with a lot of DIY artists. So DIY, for people who don't know, is do it yourself. And I was in love with that ethos. Do it yourself. Don't ask for permission. You don't need to get signed to a record label. You can just put out your own record, and you could book your own show. You could book your own show in the backyard of someone's house. You could do it at a local VFW hall, which is like a public gathering place. A bar, whatever. You don't have to wait to do things. You could just do it. If you have something to say, grab a microphone, grab a guitar, and express yourself. And while I didn't fully understand, completely this idea of what it meant to be an open source developer who can develop, permissionlessly, I don't know how to put it. I felt that it was just the way it was described to me. It felt like magic, and I feel like that's not such a cheesy thing to say. When I first met Jeff Booth, I met him at the African Bitcoin conference last year, and he said same thing. Like when he first found what Bitcoin was, he's like, well, first it was just sort of the magic of it that attracted me to it. And that's sort of what it felt like to me as well. There was just something there that I felt like I needed to dive into and learn more about. At first I bought a little bit of Bitcoin, had some XRP. Again, as I went down my own sort of learning journey for the following 2 years before I started writing about this, I quickly learned what the difference was between Bitcoin and the rest of the digital assets out there, and went far deeper down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. But yeah, I was utterly fascinated that night learning about it. There was no process of like, oh, this is a scam, it's this. By the time I sort of did just the scratch the surface level research, or just the fact that this was sort of a phenomenon through 2017, I was just immediately hooked. And I was, politically, I was the farthest thing, probably not the farthest, but I was probably center left. I was more of like a Democrat, liberal leaning. I was working with vulnerable populations. I've done work as a social worker. I was teaching immigrants of low socioeconomic status. So, my thoughts with something like Bitcoin was more like, how can this help? It's not necessarily how can I sort of preserve my own wealth, but it's more like, how can this open network help? I did like the fact that the number goes up, and I still like the fact that the number goes up. In fact, I just wrote a piece on that for Bitcoin Magazine about why the number going up is important, including just simply having more purchasing power, which I think people should have a right to have by just holding a certain type of money. But for the next 2 years, I did not get actively involved in the Bitcoin space. I was still in academia at the time. I was a college lecturer, teaching colleges ranging from Columbia University, New York University, public colleges in New York City. I felt very awkward because a lot of what I was reading in the Bitcoin space was obviously sort of this sort of libertarian, at best, if we want to talk about something that's traditional, that's sort of more associated with the left, maybe anarchism. Someone like Noam Chomsky is an anarchist. So it's like, okay, I knew a little bit about that. During those years, I actually got to speak with Noam Chomsky at an event that just popped back into my head. So yeah, I kind of had read his work and I got all that kind of stuff. Not that I think he's necessarily a Bitcoin fan, but I kept sort of studying and feeling this really weird kind of divide. Like I had two different personalities. One of them was the person who would go to teach these college classes, and if you were to say something about like Bitcoin in like a amongst the faculty at a college in like 2018, 19, still they hate it. Most people, these institutions totally hate Bitcoin. But if you were to say something back then, you literally probably you would have probably gotten given like the 7 a.m. class on Mondays and Wednesdays as like a punishment or something like that, because you're completely insane and you shouldn't be talking to the youth or something like that because you're a maniac. So there was a process. I wouldn't even say I was getting through the process, but there was sort of a reconciliation that needed to take place, right? It's like I'm reading all of this stuff that's a bit more fringe, these different philosophies on economics. To test that, also at one of the colleges where I was teaching, they allowed us to take courses. So at night, I actually took certain courses in finance. I did part of my MBA just to see if I was like, okay, I'm learning about all this stuff in Bitcoin world. Let me sort of learn a little bit more about traditional finance and see what it was. And it was funny. I remember the professor saying stuff like, anybody buying Bitcoin is going to, lose everything. And you have no idea what you're talking about and blah, blah, blah. And looking back, it's just comical to me. They're completely defending the fiat system and openly talking about how utterly corrupt it is. The bailouts needed to happen in 2008 and blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't even understand how you could argue that you're a capitalist or someone that's in favor of the market economy when you say things like this. It almost feels like it should discredit you from teaching at a business institution, but it didn't. And that's the way that narrative went. Beyond that, sitting in those classes, and I don't say this, I say this more metaphorically or as an analogy. It just kind of felt like an old boys club, even though there were plenty of women in there, women of color. You know, it's not that it was just white dudes that looked like me in those rooms, but it just felt very much like everybody was sort of networking to get their job at Goldman Sachs and to do this and that. And there was just like not a bone in my body that wanted to take that route when it came to sort of, you know, working with money or understanding it better. At the same time, and I think I've said this on previous podcasts, across town at another university, I was doing a master's in social work, and this is while I was teaching. So I was doing a master's in my, you know, in business administration at one college and a master's in social work at another simultaneously. And I think over time, I initially realized that, like, you know, it's like you can have both of those instincts. You could want the world to get better and want to help people, but also want to have a better understanding of money and how to invest and all this kind of stuff. These two things do not need to necessarily be separate. Whereas in a lot of sort of the way I was raised, I mean, I'm raised Irish Catholic. I don't know, you know, how that necessarily translates to you guys, but in, like, you know, the sort of New York Irish Catholic thing is very much like fire and brimstone. If you ever talk about money, you're going to hell and blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying that. And if my mom listens to this, shout out to my mom. She's been completely supportive of my Bitcoin journey and going down the rabbit hole. She's gone down part of it with me. She's a huge Jeff Booth and Caitlin Long fan. Shout out to Jeff and Caitlin. So there was this deep process of thinking like, okay, I don't want to go to hell. You know, I say that jokingly, but I don't want to go to hell. I want to help people. I want to understand money better. I don't want to be broke for the rest of my life. I had taken out student loans to go to undergrad and graduate school. I went to private universities, which was my own choice and my own doing. But I didn't really understand money as well. I just didn't understand compounding interest working against you and all of these things. And again, it's my own fault. But I'm grateful to Bitcoin for teaching me about all these things, the flaws in our current system. And again, I think with Bitcoin, whether or not you agree with it as a solution, it absolutely shines a light on what's going on with the current financial system, the fiat system, the financial and the monetary system. So I learned all of those lessons, and I just read and studied as much as I could, followed people on Twitter. And then I would, you know, people would say certain things and they would sort of bother me, like, this is what I think the solution to this is. And then I was like, I don't think that's the solution. That seems like we're trying to solve, I don't know, the problem with like the old way of doing it, or just feeling like it was 100% going to have to be the government that got us out of this, when in fact, we know after 2008, it was the government that kept getting us further into this. So I was like, yeah, I don't really buy that as the solution. And so I started just emailing people like, hey, here's this thing, this podcast I listened to where I just felt like somebody gave a different sort of solution. You don't have to agree with it, but this. And then people would email me back and say, okay, like, where can I learn more, or this or that? And I started compiling, like, you know, follow these 5 people on Twitter and then do this and then do this and blah, blah, blah. And I did that sort of privately because, again, having any sort of public persona where you're writing about Bitcoin while working in academia, you can ask the authors of Resistance Money about this. I've had this conversation with them. It's a very challenging thing to do. I can't even say I necessarily, I can definitely say I didn't plan on having any sort of a public persona with this when I first got into it. But we did get to a point, I think it was late in 2020, where more and more people were asking me questions. I had seen people like, you know, writers who are outside of the Bitcoin space, like Matt Taibbi, one of my favorite writers in the world. He wrote a book called Griftopia. I think that was actually his best work. That's just like, it has nothing to do with Bitcoin, but it does have, it's story of the financial collapse of 2008 and how things played out afterwards. Absolutely, absolutely super, super important book to read. But then seeing people, even like Pomp back in the day when Pomp was sort of in his heyday doing his newsletter and YouTube and podcast thing, I was just like, I kind of want to be one of these people. Like, I kind of want to do this thing. And I remember sending the first newsletter. It might have been late 2020 or early 2021. And just being in like a deep state of panic. Like, who do you think you are? Like, why do you think you can talk about money? Why do you think you can tell people about Bitcoin? And that only got sort of amplified when members of my family and friends were like, are you a scammer? Like, what, you know, like real, and people who I deeply respected. And I think what shocked me there was there was so much less curiosity than I thought there would be. There was way more, you are challenging my worldview, and I do not want to hear this. Like, I do not want to hear about a competitor to the dollar or to fiat currencies. Like, are you out of your mind? And I knew this. I knew this side of human nature because I was training to be a clinical social worker, which is a therapist. So I was counseling Holocaust survivors and active drug users in one of the worst neighborhoods in New York as part of my internships as a social worker. I was also working with immigrants, some of whom had been through trauma as a teacher. So I'm working with people where you could see when you bring up certain topics, they sort of shut off. And when you spend that much time with people as a teacher, as a social worker, you know that it's like sort of time to back off when it comes to that stuff. So I I didn't um I didn't unsubscribe people from my newsletter, but I got more explicit in saying, like, look, if this offends you, there nobody's forcing you to read this. Like, I'm not telling you to buy this. I'm not, like, I'm just telling you that I think that there's something here. And I wrote in the first edition of the newsletter, I wrote something along the lines of, like, I was a writing professor. That was my job. I was teaching, I taught all different levels of sort of teaching English as a second language. But my last few years of teaching, I was a writing lecturer at multiple universities. And I would always tell my students, if you want to see how well you understand something, write about it, and you will very quickly find the gaps in your knowledge. You'll very quickly see, like, what you actually understand and what you don't, or sort of what part of the argument you might be missing, or the counter argument that you might be missing. So I started the newsletter not as a way to, like, necessarily become the next, Matt Taibbi or Anthony Pompliano or something, but to challenge my own assumptions. And I would always say things in the newsletter like, I'm not a guru. I do not know how this is all going to play out. I'm just sort of sharing my thoughts. But some people like that. Some people didn't. Oddly enough, and, I think it's interesting to say in light of the Trump election, it ended up being a lot of, like, women of color. We use that term here. I don't love that term for a few different reasons, only because I think that term gets thrown around a lot, but regardless, I won't dive down that rabbit hole as well. But Latino women, people who started reading it, who were like, could you teach me about this? And so, I was happy to, and some of them have done really well. Some single mothers, people who are like, I want to be able to sort of invest in sort of a non-complicated way. And I would talk about price for that reason. I know people, we like to make the argument, okay, it's not really about price. Well, it is when, like, you're living paycheck to paycheck and you buy the top and then it crashes 70%. And it's very much about price to the upside, when you do buy the bottom and it does go up, and maybe you could take a little bit of that money out in fiat and pay down a loan, your house, something like that. I'm not a purist in the sense that I think you have to buy Bitcoin and hold it forever. I think you should use it however you want to use it. If you have to sell some in the short term to pay a bill, the way that I tell people was, like, with that kind of stuff, is I wouldn't sell some to try to buy back in at a lower price. But you think about it like, let's just say your student loan company or your mortgage company accepted Bitcoin. I would just send them some when the price is higher, and then you could obviously continue to accumulate. But when you have more purchasing power, when it's up much more in dollar or euro terms or whatever from the price that you bought in, I'm very much a proponent of people spending Bitcoin, of using it. But in a lot of cases, you can't, at least in the United States. So if you do have to sell a little bit to pay something down, I've helped people do that as well. So it's not, I look at it as a practical tool. But yeah, I continued doing that work, writing. And then I got to a point where the end of 2021, I couldn't teach anymore. It just wasn't in my heart. I didn't want to be involved with academia anymore. We were sort of in the throes of COVID at that point. I didn't like a lot of what was coming out of academia in terms of stuff around the vaccine. I'm not going to comment on any of that. I got the vaccine. And I don't care if you did or you didn't, but I didn't like the sort of, some of the stuff felt a bit authoritarian. Like I was being told that I couldn't enter a building if I didn't have it and stuff like that. That was more my issue. It wasn't necessarily the vaccine itself. And I just was like, I don't really want to be a part of this. So I quit without having a job. I just kept writing, and writing, I think, psychologically and emotionally has been an anchor for me. I just sort of feel like if I just continue to do the work, I'll find my way. And it seemed to have worked out that way. So I initially got a job. I got a job offer. I applied to a few different things that I found on LinkedIn. Real Vision, Raul Paul and the team asked me to join to write their newsletter. And I was like, I really actually, years ago, I was a really big Raul Paul fan. I still like him as an analyst, to be honest. I just think he's lost the plot a little bit with Bitcoin. He could do whatever he wants with Solana, Ethereum. There's no judgment. It's just a little bit of like, he really, I think, understood what Bitcoin was early on, and to sort of lose that plot at this point, I'm just like, I would just like to hear him bring it up a little bit more. But I sort of made this decision that I didn't really want to write about the broader crypto space, in a newsletter every day or whatever for Real Vision, and I turned that down. But there was also this deep, deep, deep sense of panic of like, no, you're like a hobbyist writer, you can't really do this. But they had read my newsletter, and that's why they offered me the job. So it was just a weird feeling of emotionally, I just wasn't there. I wasn't ready to do it yet. Kept applying to jobs, got different offers. I think Forbes Crypto offered me. I had a meeting with them, but again, that was like a crypto learn center. I didn't really want to do that. And then I ended up working with a company called Finder, which is sort of like a Forbes advisor, or just like a site that reviews products. It was about the broader crypto space, but I was predominantly focused on Bitcoin. I say the broader crypto space not because I was like shilling tokens, but I was reviewing like the Kraken exchange or something like that, or a wallet that holds more than just Bitcoin. It's not like you're, here and there maybe writing the difference between two different types of stable coins or something. But for the most part, writing about Bitcoin and some broader products. And I really like the people I worked with. But what I fell in love with in that job is we would do these guest posts for other websites, and it was to help get backlinks for the site. So I'd write a review of like, I don't know, Cold Card or something like that. And then I would write a piece for NASDAQ for their website, sort of, with a backlink to that review in it. So I would say why it's important to have your Bitcoin in cold storage. And I would say like, one way to do that is with a cold card. And that was our backlink. But I loved the telling the story aspect of it, being able to write about current events. And I did this all through the FTX collapse. So obviously writing about cold storage and taking your money off exchanges and, Bitcoin off exchanges was obviously, for some too little, too late of an effort on my part. Some people learned that lesson the hard way, unfortunately. So I did that for a while. And then deep down, there was something in my gut that was like, I loved the story of the circular economy, Bitcoin Beach, Bitcoin Akasi. I loved what I was learning from HRF. And I think with those worlds, I finally felt like, oh, this is my place within all of this. Like, this is where the human rights aspect crosses over with the, with Bitcoin as money and a permissionless open system. And once I found that, I had this moment, and I think I've said this on other podcasts, but I had this moment speaking with Luthando Nabambi from Bitcoin Akasi, and he was talking about living in this township in South Africa, down in the southern part of South Africa, and how he had saved in Bitcoin for a few years and was able to move out of the place he was living, where the ceiling wasn't great and there was water coming through, and he'd have to move his bed around the room when it rained, to living in like a stable house, but more than to a better living facility. But more than that, he talked about this idea that he gave up drinking because of Bitcoin. He spends more time with his wife and kids. He's more optimistic about the future with his girlfriend and child. And it was that idea of Bitcoin as a catalyst. And I felt that. I felt that catalytic effect of having Bitcoin and feeling that the future could be brighter. But I hadn't heard that from, I don't know, a black man in post-apartheid South Africa. That's a much different experience than me, a white dude in New York, being like, yeah, I feel good because I have some Bitcoin. It's like, here's someone there's been a real substantial change in their life. And I remember having this feeling that morning, and it was very, very early because in South Africa, they do this thing called load shedding. The power grid there doesn't work very well, so they lose power for like 6 to 8 hours a day. So I had to do the interview starting at 4 a.m. my time, which was I think 10 a.m. his time or noon his time, and before the load shedding started that day. And as he was telling that story, all those voices in my head that were like, I say this jokingly, but like, you're going to hell because you're talking about money, and all the people in my family who are more traditionally liberal and didn't really understand Bitcoin, they all disappeared. It was like in a moment, they were all gone. It was just like, no, I know that this is important now. That was sort of the turning point for me when I decided I want to help tell this story, that, this sort of Bitcoin as an open network, the promise of what people say, banking the unbanked, even though we're not really banking them. We're getting them Bitcoin, which is the antithesis of banking. But that idea of bringing financial and monetary access to people who, otherwise were just saving cash under their mattress and sometimes being robbed in the case of the townships and things like that, and losing that cash. So now having something where they could sort of more discreetly not only have money, but save it and save over time and hopefully make a better future for themselves. That was a very long rant, so let me stop there. I won't get into, I'll let you guys ask some questions or whatever, but I think that's the beginning of like finding it in 2018 to in 2023 starting this podcast where I was interviewing people from these places and having that conversation with Luthando, where I was like, okay, I get it now. I felt it in my gut. It wasn't just cognitive anymore. It was like, okay, this is what I want to dedicate my time to.
Frank, you are such a productive individual. Where you find the time to do the things that you've done and continue to do is fascinating to me. And there seems to be this motivation within you to put something back into your communities, educating people, supporting people, trying to understand the right approach and language. You're sensitive to different people, different communities, and that's what I've observed listening to you. And one thing, when you were mentioning about the price of beer, my mind goes back to the Times front page of the chance on the yeah. So you see the 99p for a pint, and I was in the pub the other day and I paid £9.80 for a pint, which converting that into US dollars, I don't know what that is, but it's a ridiculous amount of money. To
$12, $13 or something like that. Yeah.
That's
was it like a special brew or something, or just a regular lager?
No, it was just a Camden Pale Ale, which is like a bog standard run of the mill pint that you get in the pub. It wasn't anything special at all. So that's madness. That was my first observation there. And shout out to your Irish roots as well, because I've got some Irish heritage myself, so we've got some kinship.
To be fair, isn't like everyone in New York Irish? Like this is like a common thing.
I am sort of the stereotypical. I'm half Irish, half Italian by ethnicity. I'm a fourth generation immigrant, so my family's been here for about 100 years. But I'm sort of a bit of the stereotypical New Yorker in some ways. Yeah, there's plenty of these either partially Irish or partially Italian people like myself here.
Yeah, mate, that's brilliant. Mate, throughout your whole narrative just then, I was forming questions and then it evolved into a thought and then another question came up. So I'm just going to put some stuff out there. I don't necessarily have a question lined up, but it's constructed based on what I've heard. And you were saying about there are two personalities that you sometimes have to adopt, and I subscribe to that, because a lot of the time I was trying to convince people come to me, maybe they were curious or they got something misunderstood about Bitcoin or money, and I'd really try hard to sort of like present things in the way that I think they would understand and relate to. And I started to realize that people take on these narratives from mainstream media, legacy media, corporate, whatever you want to call it. They also have their own preconceived bias and ideas anyway, or they're too sort of like, they don't understand the complexities of money, what fiat money is. So it's hard to sort of like, I got to a point where I started getting frustrated and angry with people and like, oh, you don't understand. And, you know, that's a learning curve that I had to overcome and really sort of reconnect with myself as an individual that's also within this fiat system that's figured out the life raft. And I'm trying to put energy out there to try and put people in that right direction. And I found it was a losing battle in a way. And my wife, she's black and American. And we're often in various discussions. I listen to podcasts, she overhears it, and sometimes she tuts at some of the things that people saying because it doesn't relate to her. She constantly tells me that if they're not talking to me, they're not talking to me. So it's like a language thing, or they don't sort of acknowledge the broader context of other perspectives and things like that. So that's something I'm really trying to sort of hold on to and understand. And I know Bitcoin's global. I know there's lots of voices. There's a growing African voice in global South, in the likes of South America and things like that. But it's not the mainstream narrative that's out there in Bitcoin. So how can we sort of like break that barrier for people to sort of hear the language that will resonate with them?
This is a very, very wild question, and I think I'm okay to say this, but I wasn't told not to say this. I'll put it this way. So the first thing that came to mind as you said that was, so I was at PubKey the day that Donald Trump came to buy burgers, and both that day in the days following and before that, I had spoken with people in the Democratic Party who speak with Harris, who are advisors to her. I covered the DNC for Bitcoin Magazine. There were people for the Crypto for Harris campaign at PubKey that day when Trump showed up, and I had spoken with other local and more prominent Democrats. And the main reason they said for her not showing up to PubKey, the day that Thomas from PubKey invited Trump to PubKey, he also invited Harris, and he invited other Democrats as well. They didn't show up because she didn't show up for optical reasons, saying that it's more of like a white dude thing. Can I argue with that? I know I mean, there's plenty of black people that go to meetups at PubKey, so I know that to be untrue. But the mainstream media narrative is something that truly needs to be, I don't want to say combated, because I don't really like to use it just needs to be countered. There needs to be something else out there. And the statistics in the United States, when you look at white, Latino, black as a percentage of the population, more black and Latino people own Bitcoin than white people. So I'm not saying there's probably more white Bitcoin owners in the United States, but as a percentage of the population, there's more people who are black and Latino because they have some sort of a distrust. I can't speak for everyone, but this is what I have been told by black and Latino people, because they have some of a distrust for the traditional financial system. So I think that message ended up getting to Harris. There's a woman who I spoke with at the DNC named Cleve Messidor, who was an Obama appointee. She worked in the Obama administration, was like a long time Bitcoiner, like 2013 or 14 or something like that. And she said, there's a lot more people like me out there. Sometimes those people don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking up. And I'm going to add some context here. And I hope anyone who's listening that's black or Latino, please, don't hate me as a white person adding this context. But there's because of historical injustices in the United States, I'll just speak to my country, there's oftentimes, if people from some of these communities come into some sort of money or wealth, there's sort of an expectation that they're going to help other people from the communities, like pay bills or pay mortgages or something. So it doesn't surprise me that people from those groups would be a bit quieter about whatever wealth they've accumulated in Bitcoin. Now, if I got that wrong, I sincerely apologize to anyone listening. I'm not trying to be sort of, trying to say what's going on. I don't necessarily know, but I do know that this is a trend in the fiat world. If people come into money, I think a friend of mine actually said it, not even African-American, but an African, friend, like black tax, he called it. It's just like sort of like you have to help everybody else in your community with you if you did come into some sort of wealth or something. I'm not saying that people they're being secretive because they don't want to help their community. It's more just like, I'm not going to even pretend to know what it's like to be black in America. I mean, we had laws up until 5 decades ago saying that you weren't allowed to do certain things, drink from the same water fountain. To ignore that kind of stuff and the trauma that people carry on after generations of that, I just don't ignore it. I mean, I was a social worker, I was a teacher. I can't ignore these things. So I think that what ended up happening, and I think it's sad because I knew a lot of people who were Democrats, black, Latino, Asian, Southeast Asian, who really were hurt that Harris didn't necessarily get it and saw how damaging the mainstream media narrative was to her getting it. I think she eventually kind of got it, and that's when she came out with that statement around, like, I'm going to protect black men's right to own crypto. But I think even with that, like, everybody just rolled their eyes. I got so many texts from black people being like, what is she doing? Like, what is going on? Like, this is not how you do it. And it's, we know that that's not how you do it after 2 days ago. So it's a really complex thing. Race in America is a complex thing. I do not ignore it. I personally think it's sort of disrespectful to ignore it, nor do I think it's the only thing that matters. I do believe in merit still. I think it's just a very complicated thing, and I try to respect people's experiences. I've had many people who I'm close with who don't look like me, whether different ethnicity, gender, race, and I try to just take them at their word. These are people who I trust, when they say just about everything else. And if they told me that their experience has been different than mine in some ways, I accept that. So how to necessarily, I don't want to say fix that, what you're talking about, how to deal with that issue. What I do is I try to raise up voices of people like Lorraine Marcel from Bitcoin Data, a program in Africa that teaches African women how to use Bitcoin. I teach in the program. I tried to stay in touch with some of the people in that program and help them out with writing and some of the other endeavors that they have going on, not just Bitcoin. I do that when I can. I'm quite tired, but when I can, I try to help. But there's a part of her story, and I'm not going to get too deep into it now. After speaking with her, what she does is far more than teaching women about Bitcoin. She's a social worker in her own right. She takes on a lot. She's talking about a very sensitive subject with a population that not only has historically been financially disenfranchised, that is current day financially disenfranchised. You are not allowed to own property as a woman in Kenya. So these women, now are sort of having access to this thing that they've not allowed to have access to forever or for however long. There's a lot around that stuff, and it's a little bit of why I reject this idea outright, like just to fix the money, fix the world thing. There's been periods of global history where the money has been better and the world was still shit in a lot of ways. So it's like what I hope Bitcoin does. I wrote a piece on this for Bitcoin Magazine. I wrote a piece, Bitcoin can reduce racism. And I said can, not will, because I think it has the potential to. But I think the concept of being a Bitcoiner has the possibility to reduce racial bias and to hopefully have a bit of an inclusive effect. Because there's a really important book. It's called Bowling Alone. It's by a Harvard, I think, anthropologist or political scientist. And he said, the human condition is to have these in and out group biases. When we look at other people, if they don't look like us, we feel like they're the other, right? This person doesn't look like me. And we're programmed that way biologically. It's nothing to feel ashamed of. But once we actually get to know somebody and we have something in common with them, we like the same music, we play on the same sports team, whatever it is, then we start to look past those not superficial things, but those physical attributes that make us different from someone. And we think, oh, this person has similar sort of thoughts. They believe in empowerment. They believe people should have the right to hard money, sound money. They believe people should be able to transact permissionlessly, that everybody should have a chance to maybe pull themselves up by the bootstraps, to use an American term that gets overused, in my opinion. Once that happens, now you have a bond, and now you feel like I think that person is on your team, right? And I think we just need more of that. We need a little bit more of like groups that are a bit more, I don't want to say diverse because that word gets overused, just inclusive, where people feel that it's okay to speak up. I dealt with a little bit of this awkwardness the other night. I was hosting the live stream for the election night live stream for Bitcoin Magazine, and we had people from both sides of the political spectrum, or across the political spectrum with us. I had never in a million years that I think this was happening, but I was sort of moderating a discussion between a UFC fighter and Margot Paez. Margot Paez being like a progressive Bitcoiner. She hosts a progressive Bitcoin podcast. Shout out to Margot and to Trey from that podcast. And then this UFC fighter who actually turned out to be the nicest guy in the whole world, Ben Askren, spoke with him off camera, super, super nice guy. Wasn't even familiar with him beforehand. But to sit there and sort of understand that they were coming at this from very different worldviews, very, very different worldviews. And to try to say, guys, one, you're making it awkward for me as the anchor here, so please stop fighting on camera because I'm going to have to break this up. But two, just try to accept that accept that you both have your perspectives, just respect that and try just a little bit. I'm not even saying to dramatically shift your worldview. Just try for just a minute to try to see it from a different perspective a little bit. For someone like Ben talking about this idea of the left just hates white dudes and blah, blah, blah. It's I felt some of that. I've sat in these social work classrooms and been told that I'm evil. I'm inherently evil because of the color of my skin. It's well, that doesn't feel good. I don't like that. So I could relate to where Ben was coming from. And then Margot was talking about issues, being a woman's voice in the Bitcoin space and all of that kind of stuff. Working with Lorraine Marcel, having a mother and 3 sisters. I have very personal connections to women in this space, so I also see where she's coming. So all I hope is that we do a little bit less talking at each other and to hopefully resolve some of these issues around race and to maybe broaden the narrative and to actually make Bitcoin more inclusive. I just think it's going to take a little bit of human effort for us to say what you said makes me a little bit uncomfortable, and emotionally it's going to be easier for me to just deflect it and not actually absorb any of that. But if we really do sort of want to move the narrative forward and include more people in this and work together more, you're going to have to allow for some discomfort. It's just the way that this is all going to go, because even the idea, okay, we're Bitcoiners or whatever, it doesn't necessarily take away people's previous experiences. And that includes someone like Ben Askren's experience as a white dude who feels alienated by the Democratic Party. So without getting too political or on a high horse, the summary there, or the call to action, is like, those things that make you uncomfortable, just don't immediately dismiss them. Just try to listen a little bit, and to allow that to be a little bit of a seed in your mind to say, okay, I have my experience and that should be respected, but maybe I should do a little bit, just a little bit, to sort of try to accept and maybe allow space for other people's experiences as well.
Totally. And that we're such in a polarized world at the moment. I believe that's by design. You know, there's the deliberate sort of divide of you're right or wrong. Two things can be true at the same time. You know, you can have many different views on a issue, and just because somebody is sharing a perspective with you doesn't mean it's automatically cancelling your one out and making it not true.
Totally.
And
Yep.
you know, it's offering you a deeper understanding of a broader issue. If you continue to look through the same lens and refuse to sort of like understand and take on board, how can you then justify your own as true? So, you know, you've got to actually try and, but Bitcoin and the rabbit hole, it opens up the possibility for you to relearn, unlearn, remain
Yes.
curious as we stay here. You know, we say stay curious because it's all part of understanding and unpacking the things that aren't true, that you've been indoctrinated to understand from
Right.
your own perspective, from your own privilege, from your own part of the world that you've grew up in. And so it's hard to sort of like really take that on and understand that there are actually other people out there that, you know, hurt a little bit more than you might, and
Sure.
you're shouting from the hilltops about how painful it is for you, and then totally disregarding the people that don't even have a voice in the first place.
It's a really, really important lesson, and I would just also urge people to sort of caution. I would caution people to sort of, you know, say that, like, I don't know, things like Bitcoin fixes Africa or something like that. It's a far more complex situation. That is it a tool that can help empower people who are part of systems that have been oppressive for a long, long, long time? Absolutely, no question. But there's these other human elements that I would just urge people to try to, I won't even say embrace, just try to keep your mind open to. That's all. You know, and you don't have to allow the discomfort to get so much that it's just overwhelming. Just a little bit of like, you know what? Again, maybe I could just give some space for other people's perspective. That's all. Other people's experience.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, you know, you can also have the attitude of like, I don't give a shit at this point, which I think, or at least that's what I've learned through my years in Bitcoin. I was like, okay,
Yep.
you know, I used to be a journalist, like you have to have an open ear for both sides. Like,
Yep.
this was very much indoctrinated into myself as well, work-wise, and like within my family. My granddad was like a World War II kid, grew up after the wars, you know, very much left-leaning in Europe. So like, you have to be nice to everyone. And even when I was little, I was like, I don't really give a shit if I need to go to church on Sundays or like help people out,
okay.
you know, stuff like this.
Yep.
But then you start adapting. But what I learned through Bitcoin was like, well, it's okay to sometimes say, no, I'm not interested in this. And what really resonated with me, Frank, is when you said this whole thing, fix the money, fix the world. I'm so fucking fed up with it if I see it on Twitter.
Okay. Yeah.
And honestly, I think it's a bit of a cheap thing to say for us. It's the same cheap thing as like reposting something with like clown face and globe, because everyone knows it's so obviously idiotic what they're saying, but it's easy for clown stuff.
Yep.
And yeah, there's just some stuff we have to do as Bitcoiners where, you know, listen and try to bring in your perspective. And like you said, talk to each other and not talk against each other or something.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is that it's very, very comfortable, and I have to really, 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 really work on this as a writer. It's very, very easy to sort of create content and put messaging out there that's going to resonate with people who you know are already into Bitcoin, like to speak to the choir. So easy to do that. The real challenge to people, and this is why I took on, you know, the work at Forbes, which does try to, you know, pushes us to write more objectively about this. Like, for example, I have to very selectively use the term Bitcoin adoption. You could say usage, or you could say people are investing in it, but this idea of it, like, I have to really think about the language I use. And I think that's actually a really good practice, because a handful of people in, I don't know, a circular economy, or like 5 stores now accepted in some place in Ghana, is that really adoption? So I have to think a lot about the language I use. And then I think the biggest thing that I've learned is, with this stuff, you really, if you're trying to reach a broader audience, you have to lead with a human story. I think we all sort of know that trying to explain what a blockchain is to people, or a difficulty adjusted proof of work mechanism, that their eyes just glaze over, and it's like, dude, I'm not, you're a nerd, I'm not, I don't want to hear this from you, sort of thing. Like, it just sort of turns people off right away in a lot of situations. And I don't blame that. And not because I don't think people are curious enough or anything else. People have a lot of stuff going on. If somebody tried to describe the internet to me back in the day versus just showing me how to send an email, I would have been, like, I don't care about this stuff. It's not my thing. I'm not a tech guy or something. But yeah, and I think also, to your point though, there is sort of a defiant and punk rock at the same time. There's a defiant and sort of punk rock nature to Bitcoin, where I think you can say no. Like, for me, leaving the Democratic Party, becoming an independent, I know people in my family were straight up offended, just absolutely offended by that. And I didn't leave the Democratic Party to become like a right-wing extremist. I was just like, I just do not believe in this anymore. I'm sorry. Like, I don't believe that what they're proposing to be the solutions are. I don't believe in even what they're saying the cause of the issues are. Like, no, we talk about all these things. We haven't heard one person. I don't think we've heard one person from either political party really talk about, maybe a handful on like the right on the Bitcoin side, but really talk about the dangers of central banking. Like, when we don't talk about these core issues on either side of the fence, like, I just don't want to hear it. And I think that that's also a big part of it. But being conscious of what we're saying no to. If we're saying no to another human being and allowing them to sort of have their voice in this space, I don't recommend that. Please do what you want to do. I'm not here to tell anybody what to do. But to say no to certain things that are traditionally sort of ingrained in us, Ian, like you said, like unlearning things, saying no to things that we don't believe in anymore. This is how we move forward as a species, as far as I'm concerned. I think that's even bigger than Bitcoin. I think we have to say, like, in my gut and based on my cognition, I no longer agree with this. Like, I don't feel it anymore. I don't think it anymore. And it's not the right path for me to go down anymore. So just again, I really have come to believe in voluntarism. I don't want to be prescriptive at all as I say these things. I'm more just speaking my mind. So please take it with a grain of salt.
Actually, yeah. And before you, sorry, Joe, before you ask the question, Joel, I know we're going to get on to talking about Trump, I think, but it's hard to do that though. I want to acknowledge that it's not an easy thing to do because there's, I've started to sort of realize that it's a trauma process. You're unpacking 100%. Trauma. It's like the fiat trauma has sort of like really fucked with your mind and the way you see the world, right? And sometimes it takes a lot of reflection and pain to sort of overcome that. And I can see why a lot of people get stuck into limiting themselves to a point, because it's just too much hard work just to go and actually unpack parts of you that are complicit within the system in a way.
Yes.
And also you can't even escape it to as much as you would like when you understand Bitcoin. You can't live on a Bitcoin standard. It's not that easy. You
Very
still have
hard
to participate and know that when you're participating, you are also sort of like re-engaging yourself back into this traumatic sort of whole thing. So it's a difficult thing to escape from. So that's just all I wanted to acknowledge. But yeah, Joel, over to you, mate.
I mean, you were kind of hinting at it before with the live stream mentioned, Frank, and also with your decision to go independent. You were the host of the live stream for the election live stream with Stand With Crypto. And we did chat a bit beforehand off camera, where we went, I think the crypto, trigger word for all the maxi pads, crypto community was really visible in this election. It wasn't a decisive vote, but you could definitely see that the whole crypto lobby, whether that be Coinbase, the likes of Ripple, maybe, maybe not Ripple, that's a bad example, but like other likes of exchanges and stuff like Stand With Crypto, were really eager to actually get these voters moving, and it sort of became a single vote, a single issue vote for a lot of Americans. How did you experience on the live stream and living in New York City. How did you experience this election from that perspective? Like, was it really Bitcoin centric, crypto centric, or is it just another Fugazi we tell ourselves in the community?
No, if you don't mind, if I add a little bit of a dynamic to what you were saying, I actually went out to cover the Stand with Crypto tour in 3 of the swing states for Bitcoin Magazine, and I want to quickly just acknowledge this idea of dismissing anybody that says crypto, even if you only like Bitcoin, which I think is totally fine, which is my perspective. I mean, I get stable coins and all that kind of stuff, but Bitcoin as money, I like the idea of that. But the problem with let's ignore crypto is that means that we're ignoring the Tornado Cash trial, where legal precedent will be set over crypto assets, and we're ignoring that. And everybody who was making fun of that, well, he was building on ETH, he was doing that. It's just not cool. It's just not cool, and that's my opinion. So I'm not saying when someone talks about crypto, I don't care what people do. Genuinely, if you want to invest in Solana, you want to do all this other stuff. If that's your primary thesis, I'm not here to tell you what to do. Would I recommend it to people? No. You can read my newsletter. I don't talk about that stuff, but that's my take on things. So when people talk about crypto more broadly, you also have to realize that places sometimes where you buy Bitcoin, I know not like Relay, and I respect Relay. That's why I highlight what the work they do in my founders pieces and stuff. But there are other places, like in New York, I can't use Strike. I can't use Swan. I can't use River. I can't use any Bitcoin only exchanges. So I have to be in support of the crypto industry, because the only 3 exchanges that I can use, I can use Cash App. For some reason, I don't know what it is. I think it's fees or something. It's just much higher than buying on Bitstamp or Gemini or something. I respect Cash App and I like what they're doing, but if I'm going to buy a chunk of Bitcoin, I don't want to pay high fees on it. It just is what it is. So by default, I have to support something like Gemini. So when people talk about this, I just want to put that out there. When someone says crypto, it doesn't mean they're shilling you the latest token. Bitcoin is a crypto asset. It's one of many crypto assets. It fits into that. I do actually stand for the right for people to own whatever assets they want. At the same time, I will call them a scammer, especially if they're shilling something that we all know is a scam. So you can have both of those things. But to get back to your point, I went out to some of the Stand with Crypto dates to cover them. At first, the thing that sort of woke me up was I think these are statistics that I'm not sure everyone in the Bitcoin space knows. Coinbase did research on this. The vote differential between Biden and Trump in each of these battleground states was literally so if it was 30,000 people that decided the election in 2020, in every single one of these states, the amount of crypto owners was more than 10 times the amount. So in Arizona, I think it was 360,000 crypto owners when the vote differential was 30,000. So you didn't need every one of them to be a single issue voter. You just needed 15% of them to be a single issue voter and to say, okay, I'm voting on this, and that's what swings the election. Once I learned that, and then once I spoke with people on the ground, when I spoke with a 23-year-old Vietnamese woman who had just immigrated to the United States, who was saying oh, I don't even think in terms of left and right. I just, it's basically whoever's crypto policy, more crypto friendly. That's where I'm going. Is when I realized that we're in a paradigm shift, which also happens around what gets termed fourth turnings. I'm not going to get super into that, but Google fourth turnings. We're in a bit of a shift, I think, around the world right now. And so what I learned when I went out to those things was oh no, this isn't when I was 20 years old, I was a staunch Democrat. I think 90-something% of my friends were as well. That's not the case with the youth this time around. And the Democrats were not paying attention to that. They really were flagrantly ignoring that, just saying no, we will teach you how to think, when the youth was no, we don't think like that. So I learned that So, when you talk about something like New York, I go to meetups every week at PubKey. Shout out to PubKey. I would say New York, there weren't as many single issue voters, but I will say this. I don't know if you've seen this statistic yet. It's mind-boggling. 30-something% of New York voters went for Trump. We haven't seen that since 1988 when people voted for Reagan, when Reagan got 33% of the vote in New York. I also walked by the Trump rally at Madison Square Garden a week or two ago. You had Korean people outside, Korean Americans outside, Dominican Americans outside, Jewish Americans outside, and then you have the mainstream media reporting that it's a Nazi rally. It's not only is that wrong, it is offensive. It is offensive to people. And so I think what happened was Democrats just lost their, like, they just didn't have control of the mainstream media the way that they have in the past. What we're doing here, alternative media, just had way more of a sway on the way that they voted. I don't like to, I think a lot of people, so in a place like New York, a very liberal city, it's very, very difficult to just go out there and say I'm voting for Trump, because because so many people just get triggered and they will call you a racist and they'll call you a this and that, when in reality you might just be doing that because that's your version of a protest vote. For some people the protest vote is a third party, for some people it's Trump. But like, so I'm not going to disclose who I voted for, but I was very public that I was not voting for Harris. I made that decision a while back, and it actually had a little bit to do with what the Biden administration did to the Bitcoin and broader crypto industry, but it had more to do with when they started like suing people like RFK or Jill Stein to get them off the ballot. That was when I lost it. I was like, or when they didn't actually have a primary for Harris, I was like, you guys can't argue that this other guy is trying to overthrow democracy when you are overthrowing democracy. Yeah, like I can't listen to this anymore. Like, it's gaslighting. So, and then beyond that, as much as on a certain level, I understand why, again, Harris didn't want to speak to Bitcoin crypto for the same reason she didn't want to go on Joe Rogan. It's like a white bro thing in her mind. That's not enough for me. It's not enough. And I say that only because like the data shows that it's not a white bro thing. And you had 4 years as vice president to wrap your head around this a little bit. So to answer your question, I'll do that first. It's very difficult to know who voted for who. Some people were very overt in their opinions, but to be honest with you, and some background knowledge on like the Trump coming to PubKey thing, the heat that bar got for having Trump, the neighborhood rebelled against that bar. Like, Thomas had to make a very concerted effort to then make sure that people knew Democrats were invited as well, which they were from the beginning. Just none of them took them up on his offer to actually bring them in. The only person that responded was Trump. But it was like, that sort of social stigma, especially if you're a business owner or you don't want to be canceled, it's a really powerful thing. So I think it's really hard to know how people voted because they didn't really want to say it publicly, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. And you know what you said, one comment there before I leave it to Ian. I have a lot of friends in the mainstream media. I had 24 or 25 calls yesterday. So the day after the election, for anyone listening, we're taping this on November the 7th. So on November the 6th, I had all of these calls, a lot of stuff for Relay, obviously price pumped, you get sudden interest by journalists.
Yeah.
And everyone on the phone was like, I can't believe how we missed this. And I'm at the point now where I went, so for any of the listeners, I think it's quite obvious at this point that Ian is more of a deep thinker and I'm more of like the very simple farming guy who goes like, fuck this shit.
Think boy.
From the guts. Yeah.
Yeah. I was.
Both are important.
Like,
Both are important.
I'm like the 10th or 20th person. I was like, you're such a dumb fuck. Like, I can't believe it. I can't believe you did not see this coming. Like, you seriously trusted a rotten system. Now, I'm speaking as someone who worked in the media.
Yeah.
And you didn't see it coming that people are fed up with what you said, Frank. It's like, oh, we all call them Nazis, even though we had all of the different cultures there. And this doesn't have to do with Trump now. This can also be in Europe, for example. In Austria, we also had these elections where I have friends who now call me like a right-wing fascist because I didn't vote for the Green Party. I was like, I don't care what they do. They're stupid. Right. So what the hell's going on? I think sometimes that slap in the face for especially that part of society. And we're talking about the 1% of the 1% in the media or in any other thing. In banking, you can adapt this to anything. Sometimes losing hard really helps. So
only way to go.
So my thing after the election was like, okay, we got Trump again, so we got to have a lot of meme templates the next 4 years. Right. It's going to be entertaining again. The media will love it because they're going to make money. But we really have this opportunity where people who are really now realizing, shit, I may have been lied to, someone did not tell me the whole truth, whatever it is, I really need to step up. I think this is the moment where we as Bitcoiners and the crypto community, like you said, can go in and say, well, if it is there, imagine what happens to your money. And there is a very simple solution to this. And I can help you with the most simple terms in the world. So I think looking at this also from that perspective, that election was huge. And yeah, not going to lie. I mean, kind of enjoyed the videos today where you saw people freak out, but that's a different topic.
No, and I did too, and I will say that I don't partake in sharing it because I want
Same,
because
yeah.
cognitively I don't want that, but there's just a certain you watch these videos and you say like, so pain is a teacher. We know that from Bitcoin, right? A lot of people don't come to Bitcoin from intellectual curiosity, they come to it from pain. Pain is a teacher. The thing here is, are Democrats going to allow that to be a teacher? And I'm going to cite one person who so there's my favorite artist in the world in any genre, any form, is a hip hop artist named rapper named Immortal Technique. Immortal Technique puts out his own records. He has 3 full lengths: Revolutionary Volume 1, Revolutionary Volume 2, and then The Third World. He's half Peruvian, half, I think, Black American. He does not mince words. It is, it's just hard. I have no other, that's like the only adjective to describe it. He shared something today. This is someone who, a self-described democratic socialist who shared something today. Like, so what are the Democrats going to say? That minorities are white supremacists now? Is that going to be the argument that like all of the Latin men and the black men that voted for Trump, they're the white supremacists now? Like, how do you even come up with how do you come up with a narrative that does this? And I will say there was like, for me, it's not so much watching like the liberals break down on their whatever, on whatever video. It was just on the flight home from Las Vegas yesterday after filming the election night stream in Vegas back to New York. I turned on the plane. They had a live TV option. So I turned on MSNBC and CNN just to get an idea of what they were talking about. And I was just appalled. It was still like, we don't get why people don't see the way the world we do. And it was just like, dude, it's just like you can't even have sympathy for the fact that they're hurting because they do not. It is completely top down. Like, we are controlling the narrative. We want you to believe these things. Some aspects of that narrative I don't inherently disagree with, but it's this idea that if you do not. And I don't think the right is I don't think the right would have been any different if Trump lost. So I'm speaking about mainstream media in general here, not necessarily just the left. But this idea that I just think we underestimate people on way too many levels. We underestimate their intelligence. We underestimate their ability to sort of like follow their gut. And we just believe that people can be told. And maybe because up until now, Joe Rogan wasn't as big as he is and didn't have the power he did. And Twitter wasn't as big as it was. And now alternative things like Nostr and all these other things we're building, and alternative monies like Bitcoin that teach people about the rot in the traditional systems. With all that stuff, like the majority of the people that rejected me when I started writing a newsletter were like old, white, educated people. They're the same people that are in control of these networks. It's like, dude, I don't get any of this shit from the people you're claiming to defend, the minorities, the black people. Like, I don't get any of it from them. They're the ones that are actually asking me questions about this. Like, you're the ones telling me, no, this is not good for them or something. It's like, what kind of, like, when did this paternalism get so embedded? Why are you the person that gets to tell the world what's good for them and what's not good for them? It's just a very, very, it's a very strange thing. And that outrage, it leads to Trump. It leads to someone who come along and whether they're going to do something about people's pain and outrage, I don't know. I hope Trump does. I mean, at the very least, I hope we see Ross free and all these things. But he knows how to speak to that pain. He's not stupid. He understands the human condition very well, and he knows how to speak to it.
I think my favorite Trump moment, and that's the last thing I'll say, Ian, is
please. Yeah.
There was a comparison once where, like, how Bush, Obama, and all of these senior politicians basically announced, like, we've killed X, Y, and Z. And Trump basically comes in and goes, like, I bombed the shit out of that guy. So, like, that's the reason he won. That's very simple. And you can adapt this to so many things, also the Bitcoin community. So, yeah, it's ironic that the mainstream media is not seeing this. But then again, big slap in the face. Who knows? Maybe they'll adapt it, or maybe they'll just die. That's one of the two options.
I think so I'll shout out Richie Torres, congressman from the Bronx here, half Latino, I think half black as well, who has been pro Bitcoin digital assets for quite some time. He's also very, very pro getting the Democrats to reflect. And also shout out to Bernie. I was a Bernie bro in 2016. I kind of feel bad for the guy, to be honest, in a lot of ways, but it's but I think that what I can respect about him, while I don't necessarily agree with his monetary policy or a lot of things that he's proposing, I think he's being honest. At least where he stands. Like, he's he's so bad at rhetoric, like it's so bad at being like a smooth talker that it's sort of endearing. You're like, yeah, I back this dude. Like, he's got his worldview. It's a little bit different than mine, but like, all right, no doubt. But these are the only people he spoke out. He's like, yeah, we don't even try to appeal to real working people anymore. It's done. We don't even attempt to do this. It's just like, it's the party of the it's the party of the people I worked with in academia. Just like, and I'll say one thing about that. So I taught through the Trump administration. I taught from 2016 to 2020, and students, I would get a lot of immigrant students, and I didn't not as well as I now understand, but I didn't really understand this concept of people leaving an authoritarian country to come to something like the United States. And you had a lot of people who came from these countries who were Trump supporters, and they were being told by all their professors, like, don't even bring that up in the classroom. Whereas if you just simply said to them, why do you like Trump? Well, I come from a country where politicians promise this, this, and this, and I just want someone who's going to let me do what I want to do. Like, and once they had that breathing room, then you could have a conversation about like, well, here's what to maybe be wary of with someone like Trump. But if you don't even give people that ability to say like, here's my experience, this is why I'm gravitating to this someone, versus just telling them that they're wrong and that they're a racist, even if they're a minority or whatever, like, like that, just that they're wrong in their perspective. If you don't meet people where they're at, and we know this with Bitcoin, I know it as a social worker, as a teacher, if you do not meet people where they're at, if you do not meet people in their framework and sort of acknowledge their emotional experience, their lived experience, you're not only not getting through to them, you're probably creating an enemy. So it's just like this inability for even college professors and people who ideally should know this, but really don't. It's the reason I no longer work in the field. It's the reason I'm no longer, a lecturer in academia. It's disheartening.
Frank, it's been a fascinating conversation with you. I could speak for hours. I for myself, have learned a lot. I get a deeper understanding with everyone I speak to on here. So thank you for sharing your finite time with us here at Rabbit Hole Stories. But before we close, we always give our guests the All Roads Lead to Bitcoin challenge, where we give our guest a word and they have to try and relate that back to Bitcoin.
Okay.
So, Frank, your All Roads Lead back to Bitcoin word is bodega. How does that relate back to Bitcoin?
Bodega.
Yes.
Oh, I love that. It's so funny you say that. I right down the street from where I said I walked by the Trump rally, right down the street from Madison Square Garden, there is a bodega with a Bitcoin ATM, and it's the only Bitcoin ATM that I know of in New York City. So there's your connection right there.
Perfect.
There it is. Yeah.
Perfect. Nice and easy.
Yeah, that was a great one. I also want to, I think it's like in a the Italian American thing in me. I want to apologize to the audience for the long rants. It's just the way that I am, and I apologize for it. So if the hosts here, if Joel and Ian didn't get as many questions in and I was just ranting, please accept my apology.
You're just making our job a whole lot easier. So
okay.
It's literally ask a question, wait for Frank to answer, go on mute, and then do it again.
Yeah, like that sailor level responses. But
on an intellectual level, when he goes into like historical context and all this stuff, I'm just like, this is a smart dude.
You're in trouble as an interviewer, Taylor, if he goes like, and then it goes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's over. Yeah. It's done. Yeah. But thank you both of you to having me. And I think, thank you for listening. As I think we got to discuss some things in depth beyond Bitcoin, but also how Bitcoin applies to those things. And yeah, just as a final thing to the audience, again, just a little bit outside of your comfort zone. That's all. Just try to, especially if it is someone in your world, in your Bitcoin orbit, that's maybe of a different background than you or something else. Try to also, take this opportunity that you have Bitcoin in common with them to maybe get to know them a little bit better and, give them some space to share their experience as well.
Frank, if people want to get in touch with you, where is the best place to? And you have anything to shill, feel free to do so now.
No shilling. You could just Google my name, Frank Corva. On X, I actually I'm trying to spend a little bit more of my time on Nostr. I really like Nostr. I like the idea of it. So Nostr, Frank Corva, I don't know my NPub. It's actually pinned up. It's my pinned tweet on X is my Nostr NPub. So you could find that there. I think you can follow me at Bitcoin Magazine or on Forbes. You can click a follow button. But I think if you want to make it easier for yourself and sort of read whatever I'm doing, I still write a Substack every week. It's not all that profound. I mostly just sort of include links to other pieces that I worked on during the week. And, it's just that once in a while I'll include some more in-depth analysis or thoughts or something like that. But yeah, Substack, Frank Corva at substack.com. Yeah, Forbes, Twitter, Bitcoin Magazine, wherever you find me. I think a quick Google search will return a number of different ways to find me.
Nice one. Again, thank you for your time and for our audience. It's been a fascinating one. And as always, guys, stay curious.